Good evening. Hope you're all well. Thank you for coming today despite the terrible rain outside. Unfortunately, it's not sunny and warm in Chapel Hill. Today we have a very special event, an event which we do not often have. Normally, as you know, we have talks and discussions and panel discussions, but today we also will have a discussion, but mostly we will show a documentary movie, and then we will have Q&A and a lively discussion afterwards. As you know, I'm Klaus Lares. I'm the Richard M. Krasner Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Before we start and before I introduce our speaker, I would like to remind you that we have a mailing list which you please fill in. If you haven't been part of the mailing list, then you should use that opportunity to sign up, and you will get all information about all of our events. And then I would like to remind you to watch our YouTube channel, where we will show all our events. We are videotaping all our events, and also a little series called 5-Minute Insights, a short interview with the speaker, which we always do after the main event. So please, if you have a chance and you have nothing better to do, late at night or over the weekend, our YouTube channel is there to save you and rescue you. The address is youtube.com/KresnoUNC. We have two more events this semester, apart from today. That is already this coming Monday, about the trade war between China and the United States. And then our final event this semester is on the 27th of November, and that is a panel discussion by a scholar from China, a scholar from Japan, and a scholar from Washington, D.C., talking about the strategic relationships between the United States, China, Japan, and Korea. So that also should be a very interesting and illuminating event, like the event today, of course. It is a great pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker today. That is Jocelyn Ford, a journalist and filmmaker. And Jocelyn and I met a few months ago in Beijing, while I was based in Beijing, working at the German embassy. And I went to an event at the Carnegie Endowment, I believe, on North Korea, I believe. And there I saw this lady sitting in the first or second row, and afterwards we got talking. And ever since we have stayed in touch. We often went for coffee or went to events together or met at events. We had an interesting time in Beijing, and of course Jocelyn has been living in China for 18 years now. She has been in Asia altogether for over 35 years, and so she was able to give me lots of useful advice and information about China and about Beijing, and we had many lively discussions, I believe, though we didn't always agree, I think. Jocelyn was for many years based in Japan, where she worked for a US public radio station. She was a bureau chief in Tokyo. She has been working a lot for media freedom in East Asia. She was one of the first foreign journalists who was part of the Japanese Prime Minister's press corps and covered the Japanese Prime Minister. She, in particular, while in Japan, she pushed the issue of comfort women, and she was one of the leading forces who made eventually the Japanese government recognize that there was something like forced prostitution during the Second World War. Then, in 2001, Jocelyn relocated to China, and she has been co-hosting, she was the first journalist who co-hosted a China Radio International news show, and that was quite an achievement at that time when China was still much more closed than it is perhaps today. The documentary movement, Nowhere to Call Home, Tibetan in Beijing, has been much applauded in the West, in the United States, but also in China, surprisingly enough. And she will certainly explain to us why or what the response to her film has been all over the world. In a minute, Jocelyn will tell you much better than I can some information about the film and also what it is like to work as a journalist in Asia and particularly in China. So she will give a brief introduction to both her film and her work in Asia, and then we will show that movie, which lasts around about 60 minutes. And after that, we will, as usual, have a very lively Q&A session. I will probably start with 2 or 3 interrogating questions, and then we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jocelyn Ford to UNC.
First, thank you, Klaus, for that very generous introduction and this kind invitation. It is really an honor to be here and to share my film in this part of the world. So, as you've heard, I've lived in Japan since 2001 and been really privileged to see a lot of change. Excuse me. China. This is one of, as Klaus mentioned, that I was able to show this in China over 50 times. And one aspect of this, which I'd like to share after you watch it, is how Chinese youth have responded to the film. As you probably know, it's very difficult for journalists to work in China. We are restricted in our movements and where we can go and who we can speak to, and people who speak to us also may face some issues, especially in areas right now in the far west. How many of you are familiar with what's happening in Xinjiang? With the Uyghurs, the Muslim ethnic, Turkish-related ethnic minority, about 1 million, we believe, are locked up in sort of re-education camps, and it's really extremely difficult to get information out of there right now. So a lot of my colleagues are going around, but they're not really able to talk to people. So what you'll be able to see today is probably the first film about a Tibetan rural migrant to an urban Chinese city, and the first view of what it's like to be a Tibetan woman in a rural village. It's always much more interesting to talk after you've seen it, so I think with this I will let whoever wants to press the button, kind of do that, turn off the lights, and please enjoy the film. I look forward to your feedback at the end.
Thank you.
Let's ask you a few questions before we open it up.
For sure, absolutely.
One question simply is...
Make them easy.
I will, definitely. You met a young lady from Tibet, and there was a problem and you got a little involved. But why would you have a camera following you right from the start?
Right from the start. So how many of you thought I had a camera on the first day? Filmmaking. So I'm a radio journalist, and at the time, how many of you have listened to Radio Lab? So I was doing Radio Lab pieces, which are very much in the moment. So you just record everything that's going on. So I happened to bring my tape recorder on day one and a small camera. I'm a journalist. These things happen.
Did Santa ever object to that?
No, so I think one of the things which I've learned so much from Zanta, and I think not so many people realize that she has affected my life as much, perhaps, or almost as much as I've affected hers. So she did not grow up with media. She did not know the power of film. So when I asked her, may I film, could I record? Why? Of course, why not? She didn't realize what it could lead to, and neither did her family. So according to US requirements, you want to get someone to sign and say it's okay for you to do this, and what I might be doing with the material, and she was happy to do that, and her mother was just like, why are you asking me this? You're my daughter, you can do whatever you want. And I learned something very important from this. I think a lot of times that our ideas of what is ethical is completely inappropriate in another environment.
I know you are a very compassionate woman, but did it ever occur to you, particularly at the beginning, why should I get involved? Why don't I just get on with my own life and leave Santa to her life?
Well, as I think I may have said in the film, I didn't really want to get involved. I knew, as a journalist, I knew a lot of people who have a lot of difficulties, and he's not the first child I've sent to school in China. And I know, how do you rationalize when you're sending a child to school and someone in the family gets deathly ill? You're going to take on all of the family, how can you send a kid to school and not save someone from dying, sort of thing. I mean, I didn't want to be put in that position, so I tried to stay away. I just paid the school fees for the first year, but when I saw how everything was stacked against them, I couldn't stand it, so I got involved, for better or worse.
When you went to Tibet with her, did you expect the reception you had, or did you expect a much more hostile reception?
I didn't know exactly what to expect. I expected a more hostile reception. I didn't know if authorities would come and say, get out of here or whatever, on the one hand. So I didn't know if I could only film for a few days. And I didn't know if, how her community would respond, because there were all these rumors about me, that I was a man and all this sort of thing. So I had no idea. And when I arrived there, I like to go out and explore, and she said, no, you can't leave our house without me. There are dogs out there, and you certainly can't go into anybody's house. You might be poisoned.
Do you think that was true, or that was just overblown caution?
So this is one of the big difficulties which I still struggle with. I mean, it's now actually 10 years later, and those threats that, I don't know if you remember from early in the film, that Zanta was threatened with a knife by her father-in-law. And the community at that time was so concerned, a lot of other members of her community were in Beijing at that time, that they guarded her door at night. I didn't know whether to take it seriously or not, but I tried to find out exactly what her brother-in-law had done that had led to his execution. And apparently he hadn't killed anybody, but I didn't know. So when I arrived in the village, one of the first questions I asked was, how many murders have there been in this village, trying to gauge the situation. And I was, there's one guy, and there he is. Oh yeah, and then there was another woman who was killed, but she was a woman, so we didn't count that.
Tell us, to generalize it a little bit, is Santa's experience in Beijing typical, or is it a particularly harsh one? What is the fate of minorities in China, and how has it developed since 2008, when you started producing the film?
Right, so it is a long time ago now. I think we have to take into consideration her economic status, her lack of formal school education, and as well as her ethnicity, and of course her gender, not speaking Chinese well. So basically, minorities who have been Sinicized and who speak Chinese, perhaps without an accent, who have accepted Chinese culture and behave according to the expectations from the majority Han Chinese population, are treated differently. And so I would say that her treatment is common among those who have not been assimilated. The Uyghurs that we were speaking about earlier, the Turkic population in the far west, are among those groups, and the Tibetans. And they're the ones who have stood by their own culture, want their language to continue, etc., etc. Whereas even, and I don't know if there maybe the people from these groups in the room would like to speak out, but for example, I meet fewer Mongolians who are in touch with their culture, and as many of you know, there are 56 official ethnic groups or minorities. Anyway, 56 I think is the official, including the Chinese, and many of them who I've met do not speak their own language at all. So those who have assimilated are not treated as roughly.
So in her case, it really was a language that she immediately could be spotted as non-Chinese.
Or not, the way she carries herself, her clothing, I mean everything about her physical appearance for a Chinese person would be obvious. And it would be obvious that she had not assimilated. So, and the way she spoke, of course. And her sisters, a lot of her other relatives are there, and they do not speak much Chinese at all. And one thing which I was quite surprised by, that her sisters don't even know numbers, so they can't dial a telephone. that vulnerable. And when they sell things on the street, in the beginning, they couldn't make change. I think they've learned how to do that. But, they depended on their customers to,
Was there any attempt by Santa to assimilate more clothes-wise? I mean, language-wise it would be difficult, but there are, as you said, other ways and means which make it stand out.
Right, so I was also in a very difficult position because when I first went there, you see her walking up to this mall where she can't get the job, and when she showed up that day, I was going like, wearing these clothes is going to be really difficult. But of course, she's proud of her culture. She doesn't, want to wear, well, at that time, she said she didn't want to wear Western clothes, but more importantly, she said, it's the men in our village, they don't allow us to. And so after that job interview didn't go very well, I suggested, well, would you consider wearing other clothes? And she said, I would, but just I couldn't be seen by other members of my community. And to this day, I bought her eyeglasses several years ago because her eyesight is very poor, and she will not wear her glasses if she thinks that another person from her village will see her, because they will think, oh, you're too big for your britches, you think you're so great you need glasses. People in her village just don't do that. So there's a lot of different conflicting pressure. She today wears a beautiful assembly of all sorts of clothes. My mother's given her hand-me-downs. Lots of other people have given her clothes. So she today is wearing a very different wardrobe from what you saw in the film as well. She calls them Chinese clothes, we would call them Western.
And how is the boy doing?
Okay, so her son, as we speak, is in New Hampshire studying at a Waldorf school. It was a really, really challenging road. In about 4th grade, I got him into a public school finally. Basically, his mother brought him to the school. They sent her across town and said, no, you're not supposed to register here. And I said, yes. I looked it up. I contacted them. Yes, you are. Go back. We both showed up. And when I showed up, because of the way I look, they said, oh, yes, of course, we're good to our minorities. He can have a place. And I said, well, and he has 2 cousins, and they need to go to school. That's Chinese law. There's a requirement that you go to school at a certain age. And he said, oh, you can't do that. What else do you want? Sort of thing. But those 3 children were admitted. And other children from I call him the one-eyed man. You see him at the roof in the beginning. That he has very close relations, shall we say, with the police, and he was able to get some other children into school as well.
It probably wasn't just the way you look, but the way how formidable you are. That probably got...
Yeah, I mean, why would somebody who's able to take a knife and whip it around be afraid of me? But anyway.
Thank you. Let's open it up. Yes, please. Brian.
3 questions, please. Well, firstly, extraordinary what you did there. You said that she influenced you a lot. How have you changed as a person for having spent all this time, made this commitment to her, or with her? Number 2, tell us about that trip from Beijing to Tibet. That must be a long way. And number 3, tell us about your shoes.
Thank you, I'm glad you noticed. I'm not sure I can remember all of them at once. But the shoes were actually bought, I'll link the questions. The shoes I bought in Western China in Chongqing. And as an indirect result of this film, I'm about to head out there as a professor of sorts in media studies. I will be doing media literacy, helping students learn to podcast, make films, and that sort of thing, and focusing on issues that I think are of social concern. And Zanta has paved that road for me. Thanks to this film, which I was able, as I mentioned earlier, to show in Chinese classrooms, I came to understand that Chinese youth are really quite sympathetic, empathetic, and concerned that people in their society are living like this and they want to change it. But when I went into the classroom, I realized they didn't have the intellectual framework for thinking about stereotyping, discrimination, the relationship, and the institutional relationships that make this situation. And so I developed a curriculum, I call it global competency, especially targeting students who plan to study abroad. But when I brought it, I was invited to speak at anthropology and education conferences in China. Everyone said, you can't, everybody needs this. And my personal view is everyone in the world needs it. If you look at the headlines of the local college newspaper today, it's shocking and horrific. We all need to learn to get along with people who are very different from us. And though I've lived in many countries and lived in Japan longer than anywhere else, really Zanta's worldview was so different from mine. She gave me an incredible course in how to engage with someone who is almost the opposite. She's living for her next life, and she lives in a very vertical, top-down society. And I was brought up to think that everyone should have an equal choice. That's the ideal, and it should be a horizontal society. So I had to learn to put up with or accept her putting me up here when that's not what I'm comfortable with. And to tell you the truth, I think I've sort of slanted her closer to me than she has me to her. So.
She probably would say the opposite.
Well, no, she is able to stand up and talk and stand for her own position now, where in the beginning she would think that I was, whatever I said was right. She's learned to value herself. And for me, that's huge.
Thank you.
Just what the trip was like.
The question about the trip from Beijing to Tibet.
Yeah, very long. You saw, this is the short version. If anyone wants to see the full director's cut, 83 minutes, it has what happened on the trip. Zanta,
How do we get it?
when the rock slide came and fell on my side of the car, the first thing Zanta did was pull me down so that I wouldn't be injured. When I thought she should protect her child, he was on the other side. We survived, obviously.
So I have a question. You mentioned he's at the Waldorf school, but I need you to elaborate. So then does he speak English fluently, and how is he acclimating, and what's the homesick issue, and how old is he, and what else, and can you fill in a lot of this?
So he's now 18. It was his decision to study abroad. English was his favorite language. Now, when he got into a public school, very sadly, one of his earlier experiences was being told by other students that the teacher told them not to play with him. So he was othered. He lost, he was not very inclined to want to study when he was treated this way. It wasn't just once. I mean, some teachers were supportive, but too often he had these experiences with making him feel unwelcome. And of course his mother had been made to feel unwelcome, so he experienced that most of his life. So he decided, so English was his best subject. He decided he wanted to study in the US, and he impressed in a video interview, he impressed the school enough so that they gave him a major scholarship. We're still paying, and other friends and supporters are helping raise money, and I usually carries some good jewelry around, so she now makes contemporary Tibetan jewelry, so that's going to help support his fees. But I think the most important thing, he basically, and you see in the film, he's a really lively kid and sort of the life of the party and funny, and you got that impression? Shortly after that, he went silent. And until he arrived in the US, he was basically silent and didn't speak. And my image was that his life was so painful that he built a tomb around himself. And after going to this school, you could see he was chipping his way out, and now he is much more articulate. He speaks English quite well. I was at his school this week, and the teacher said it's astounding that he has hardly any accent at all. They're not always sure what he's understanding. His worldview and ability to conceptualize, or what he conceptualizes, is quite different from what the other students from other backgrounds do, as is true with his mother.
But is he able to make friends here? I'm trying to find out, how he is psychologically, emotionally.
He has a few friends. He has one teacher he was quite close to. Unfortunately, that teacher is no longer at the school. But that's still an act in progress. It's his second year now. So the summer he spent with a family that adores him, and he yeah, he was quite relaxed and all that, but I think in school there's still a lot of pressure. His academics aren't quite the same as others, but he loves it.
Thank you very much. There was a question here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing this. I have a question about language. I noticed the agreement that you have to sign with the grandpa. That was done in Chinese. And did Xanta express to you any ambivalent concerns about the loss of Tibetan language, both for herself or her family, for Yangqing?
Right, so when I first met Xanta, and she wanted her son to go to school, I said, do you want to go to a Tibetan school? Now, first of all, we should understand that she speaks this language, Hema, which is very different from the three main dialects of Tibetan, not mutually understandable. Her response was, no, he should not go to a Tibetan school because as a child with no father and no brothers, he would be bullied. And so she didn't want that. She spoke to him in his own language. He still speaks his own language. Unlike a number of other children from their school who've also left and are going to Chinese language school, who do no longer speak to their parents in their own language. So that is important to her. When I first met her, she said he'll never lose that. He'll never, he'll always be Tibetan. My impression is that she didn't have the world experience, the experience to understand what might happen. But now she does value that the culture is under threat, and we've as of this summer I helped her create a Tibetan jewelry culture workshop that will help keep a lot of the stories and the symbols and their traditional knowledge alive through jewelry and the stories she tells through and what it means in their culture. And that's very important to her. She really enjoys doing that and sharing her culture with everybody in the world.
Thank you. Oh, yes, please.
Yes, thank you so much for what you've done. I'm curious as to whether he kept the relationship with the grandfather. Has he gone back to see him? And does he have that relationship?
Thank you. This summer, it's been a very troubled relationship. But this summer when he went back, the situation had changed. I think his grandfather, his paternal grandfather, did not bully his mother in front of Yangqing. He sent her away, gave 100 renminbi, $16 to go play football, and then would start to bully her. But he would not do it in front of his mother, which is huge. And Yangqing said, when it came to mealtime, well, my mother's been slaving away in the kitchen all day, and I'm not going to eat. In fact, none of us can eat until she sits at the table, which of course is not the traditional culture. He said, I love my mother. And then this is according to Xanta told me this. And then he said, and I won't let my wife do that either. That's the way they do things over there. So he is exposed to different ideas and different values, and he is bringing some, I think he's picking and choosing. And he was more or less a peacemaker in his own family when he went back. When he went back, a lot of the usual conflicts Xanta tells me about just didn't happen. So hopefully that will continue. I think he does want to be a good grandson, but he told I don't remember exactly what he said, but he said, and Xanta for the first time said, if you treat me well, I'll still take care of you, but I'm not, you can't bully me, you can't take over my life anymore. So.
Thank you. Any more questions? Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
You said that Xanta was the first from her village to, I didn't hear this mic.
Yeah.
I want to make sure people can hear me. You said that Xanta was the first in her village to go to Beijing, or to go to the city. China, of course, now is experiencing a huge migration encouraged by the government from the countryside to urban areas. Have there been others from that village who have followed in Xanta's footsteps, so to speak?
Yeah, so let me be clear that her generation is the first generation to go to the village. So she was not the very first person. Somebody else went and said, basically, the streets are paved with gold, you can make a lot of money, so they all went. Since then, though, some have have started touring the country, going to various fairs, and then they've made a lot of money and they've gone home to build houses and things like that. Unfortunately, the story with their children is not always as positive as Zanta. So Zanta has very little money, is basically impoverished, but her friend, best friend, who has a lot of money, said, "You did the right thing." Because I go back to the village now, and my son is there doing drugs in front of me, and I tell him, "Don't do that," and he says, "Where were you when I was a kid? You went away. Why should I listen to you now?" And my understanding is that narcotics are a huge problem in the local school. I've seen a video of a brawl of students fighting with each other and that sort of thing. There's sort of a drug warlord thing there. Kids get shaken down and all that sort of thing. And that was, Zanta didn't foresee that exact scene. But she, 10 years ago, she knew that the potential for this sort of abuse was there, and that's why she wanted her child to be in Beijing, in a Chinese school as opposed to a Tibetan school.
Thank you. When you compare the fate of the Tibetans and the fate of the Uyghurs in Beijing or other big Chinese cities, is it very comparable? Is there a major difference?
So I think it's important to understand that the Tibetans culturally have more affinity with Chinese in that they're Buddhist tradition. And some Han Chinese say, the Tibetan Buddhism is a fast track to a better world. It's more effective than our style of Buddhism. So there is a romanticism, much like there is in parts of the West, about these beautiful mountain areas and all of that, and part of the culture, not all of the culture, but pick and choose sort of thing. Whereas the Uyghurs really don't have any of that.
Because
they're Muslims. Their culture is so different, and there are negative stereotypes about both groups, but there's also some positive stereotypes for the Tibetans, whereas for the Uyghurs there really isn't that much knowledge or positive.
So re-education camps for Tibetans wouldn't be obviously on the cards, for the reasons you just mentioned.
I wouldn't jump to any conclusions.
Yeah.
I think it's a great concern, and I'm also very concerned that with basically all the oxygen is sucked out of the rooms everywhere in the world for some obvious reasons about politics in the US. So a lot of things I think situations are being aggravated, and human rights violations are much easier in this environment that we're in now. What's happening with the surveillance in Xinjiang, is that sort of a test case for the rest of China? There are some people who are concerned about that. There are all sorts of crackdowns going on, and I've heard anecdotes about what's going on in various Tibetan areas, but I have not been there myself, so I can't speak to them. My concern is that, yes, all the media attention on Xinjiang is so important, but nobody's really looking about what's spreading outside of Tibet, and I've just seen little hints that similar ideas might be spreading. So I really think that this is something that there needs to be a lot more attention paid to. Anybody here want to be a journalist? Anyone here planning to go to China or Tibet soon?
Sure.
Yes. Okay. And if you are, this university that I'll be at in Chongqing might welcome you to come to campus. So.
Well, thank you very much. We'd love to take you up on that invitation. We are coming. Yes, excellent. Well, thank you very much. That's very good of you. Ryan has another question.
Right. You talk about mass migration.
Michael?
Thank you. You talk about migration. From what I could understand when you were there, it's very difficult to get a permit to go to Beijing, because if you don't have an ID, you don't get health insurance, you don't get into the schools, you're illegal. Can you explain that?
So the hukou, I think you're referring to the hukou system where you're born, you have your identity there, and you have social services only in that area, which various areas have various different rules. So Beijing a couple of years ago said, no, it doesn't matter if you have a hukou, all children should go to school, and they tried to close down the schools like the one you saw here, which are for migrants only. but these things come and go, and no one ever adheres exactly to the rules or the laws or the regulations. So it has been easy, well, and then last year Beijing tried to kick out, my words, about, they want to reduce the population, and so they used a big fire as an excuse to close down a lot of the cheap houses. So perhaps several million people left Beijing. The streets are much emptier now than they were before. I used to have 5 places I could buy vegetables within 2 minutes of my door in Beijing, and now I have 1, because all of these little shops have been basically closed down. And so, a lot of times now they're using economic measures perhaps, or forced demolitions of cheap housing and that sort of thing to control the population, as opposed to the hukou, the permit, housing permit.
Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for this wonderful film. I just had a question about, I guess, the reception of Tibetans and other ethnic minorities in different cities. Obviously, this is Beijing. You're going to have one set of views. It's a coastal, cosmopolitan Han city. If Santa had moved to, say, Xi'an or Chongqing, would the reception have been a little bit different? Would she have been treated differently? Would she have encountered the kind of casual discrimination that she did in Beijing?
Excellent question. Obviously, this hasn't happened, so we don't really know. But there are, I think, yes, there are regional differences. However, in Chengdu, at least where there's a large Tibetan population, because it's close to her area in Sichuan, she's actually from a province now called Sichuan. Formerly, the Tibetan border was in that place, but it was cut up after 1949. So there are a lot of Tibetans in Sichuan, and Zanta has told me about the reputational problem there too. I mean, I think we're seeing a lot. It's very complex. You've got one group which has very low education and fewer economic opportunities, coming into areas which are getting very rich very fast. And so she will tell stories about, why my people are getting a bad reputation because we're cheating and stealing and this sort of thing to get rich quickly. So in Chengdu, it depends where you are. I'm not convinced that would have been a better place, but we did go do a workshop in Guangzhou, a Tibetan junior culture workshop, and she just thought it was the best place on earth. She was treated very politely, even on the trains and the streets, unlike in Beijing. Guangzhou being closer to Hong Kong and having more experience with the rest of the world. So we've discussed this several times, whether that might be a suitable place to move to. We also went to Sichuan near Chongqing, and she seemed to feel more comfortable there too. So it's unclear. But Beijing is notoriously hostile, because the emperor was there, and so people think that they're better than others, perhaps, is the stereotype.
Doesn't happen in other countries at all.
Never. No.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. Let me just ask you about your journalism, which is independent from this movie, your radio and newspaper journalism. So what it is like, and how has it changed, let's say, over the last 10 years or so, working as a Western journalist in China and Beijing mostly?
So I've been in China since 2001. I worked for 1 year for China Radio International, and then I opened a bureau for Marketplace, the public radio show. And until 2008, I was very active I started the Press Freedoms Committee at the Foreign Correspondents Club, and we started lobbying for better working conditions, because at that time, pre-2007, in the run-up to the Olympics, officially, for journalists to leave Beijing or wherever you were assigned to, you had to get permission every time you left the city and wanted to report something. And of course, then, if you did get permission, you'd be told you couldn't do it. You'd arrive and be stopped. So that improved thanks to the Olympics, that the rules were loosened. However, instead of going after journalists, now oftentimes authorities will go after sources. And again, this is a situation with the Uyghurs that you can't interview anybody because you don't know what will happen to them. There are sorts of arbitrary, you go to a place and you're told it's off limits, you're not allowed to be here, no reason given. There's a certain amount of violence. If you go, the journalists who have been to Xinjiang, which I have not been recently, are followed, prevented. There are all sorts of obstacles. If you take pictures of something, it might be ripped out of your camera. You do your best to protect it, but there are threats to your staff, threats to the family of staff, and this sort of thing. So the situation has rapidly gotten much worse in the past few years since President Xi Jinping came in.
Thank you very much. Any remaining questions? Yes, please.
I'll just ask one question. So this morning's BBC News, they talked about a Pakistani woman, a man who had married a Chinese woman. And maybe some people have heard it, or maybe you have.
Can you speak up a little bit?
Yes, so on BBC this morning, there was about a Pakistani man who is working in China because they need people to help there. And he had married a Chinese woman, and apparently the Chinese, and they had a son, and they've taken his wife and the son away, so this way he will not become a Muslim or whatever, the son. So how come the Tibetan, they didn't do the same thing so that the son grows up more like a Chinese and is indoctrinated into that culture? They don't do that to anybody else over there?
Oh, they do. So there are special schools where students from Tibet or Xinjiang are brought to citicize them, and that's been going on for quite some time, but it's not a majority. And it used to be possible to teach Uyghur in the schools in Xinjiang, but that again has been closed. And in Zanta's area, the schools also do not allow them to teach Tibetan to the children. So it's something similar has gone on, and that's why the previous question, I think we need to be vigilant about what is happening else outside of Xinjiang. Is that the petri dish, the test case? And does the rest of the world care? I hate to say this. People, what is the rest of the world doing? If there are a million people locked up. I remember when I was a child reading Anne Frank's diary and being told, of course, we could never do this again. And now we have a population which is targeted to eliminate their ethnicity. We presume. I don't think anyone has seen an internal document that explains exactly what's going on, but that's what people experiencing the re-education camps are saying. So, are people not going to China to do business, to not showing up for conferences? I know Cornell University just severed a program with one of the leading universities, Renmin University, because their Marxist students who stood up for labor rights were then disappeared. Some of them were beaten. And that was the first that I'm aware of, that anybody has, and that was not even about what's going on in Xinjiang. So I really do think, I hope that conversation will be taking place. Is this acceptable in the world we live in, by the world's second largest economy? And if this is, then what kind of world are we all going to live in? Because China's economic might is such that its values will then influence the United Nations, are influencing the United Nations, will influence all of us round about.
So do you expect that public pressure from abroad could make a difference, or would it just be ignored?
So I did have this discussion when I was in Beijing. China doesn't care about the world anymore. I actually disagree respectfully, because if the authorities in Beijing were really not concerned, they would let journalists in. But they don't. They're very careful to keep images out. Mm-hmm. Right, so they haven't cut it off. Print journalists can go there, right? But it's really difficult for TV. And when you don't have a TV story, the world doesn't react in the same way. There was a change in attitude after this summer when the United Nations took up this issue, and it basically officially said we think there might be up to 1 million or whatever large number of people. The Chinese government then started to come up with other descriptions and reasons why this is happening, and so that wouldn't happen if they really weren't concerned at all. I think it's also noteworthy that Muslim countries have not responded by and large. I think that might begin to change as these sorts of issues come up. But there, in Kazakhstan, for example, there are a lot of Kazakhs who have also ended up in these camps, and because of money talks.
So did you have problems when you yourself went to Tibet and coming back to Beijing? As a journalist, did that make your life more difficult? Or was they becoming more suspicious of you, developing into someone one has to be very...
I think they're really China poses as a quandary for a lot of news organizations. There are organizations that, because of visa concerns, if you do something that the authorities don't like, maybe you won't get your visa for your replacement journalist, or won't be able to expand your bureau and all that sort of thing. I often say, I enjoy being in China. I think that it's important that the rest of the world understands China, so I hope that I can remain there. But at some point, you have to decide, what's it worth to you?
What's the position with the Tibetan...
You need a microphone.
Sorry, yeah. What's the position with the Tibetan liberation independence movement? Is there any vitality, life in that, any prospects, or is the Dalai Lama just off in some other world?
So I think these are slightly different issues, because the Dalai Lama is not advocating independence. He's advocating the cultural area, which is a very large, for people, now I've forgotten the exact numbers, but for people to say, well, what's going on? If you look at the whole western part of China, if you include Mongolia, it's, a quarter of the country, a third of the country is original homelands for ethnic minorities. So if you took away all of this area, does anyone know the number off the top of their head? No. It's a very large area, and this is really, to keep the country together is about territory. So the Dalai Lama is not seeking independence. He is seeking that large area, which includes parts of many provinces outside the Tibetan Autonomous Region, Gansu, Sichuan, Yunnan, etc., that they have real autonomy and real cultural autonomy. So they will be able to teach Tibetan and continue with their traditions. So that's what he is seeking.
Is there any activism there within those areas for that?
So there was, I'm not sure if any of you read or saw the New York Times video of a language activist who said we simply, according to the Constitution, we should be able to study our own language. So he went to Beijing and tried to file a lawsuit, was turned away, etc., etc. This was all documented by a New York Times video, and that activist, language activist, is now in prison for separatism. It's complex. Had that story not appeared in the New York Times or not been a video, perhaps the consequences would have been less dire. I spoke to the journalist after that. He said that individual was aware of the potential consequences and was willing to bear them. It's hard to tell once it actually happens. Right?
And one thing is sure, if they throw you out of Beijing, you're always welcome in Chapel Hill.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a great event today. Thank you for letting us watch the film and discussing it with you. And seriously, you're very welcome to come back. Thank you, Jocelyn Ford.
Thank you. I hope I can come back under other circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for staying until the end, and I hope to see you on Monday already. The next event is on the trade war, US-China, also something very exciting, on Monday, exceptionally 5:30 p.m. in this very room. Thank you.